When you start scaling to 2, 3, 4, 10, 20 teams, it's really a problem of dependencies. All of a sudden, everything you do requires a change in another team. Loads of teams being very busy doing stuff, but nothing comes out because there's no delivery coordination. There's no global prioritization. Everybody's like optimizing at a local scale and actually treading on everyone's toes at the global scale.
Welcome to Getting to Zero, a podcast about digging into the biggest problems in software development and how different people are trying to solve them. Our guest today is Fabrice Bernhardt, who's the CTO and co-founder of Theodo, which is a software consultancy firm with over 700 people and over 100 million in revenue. He is also the co-author of the book, the Lean Tech Manifesto, which digs into the challenges that the Agile Manifesto has when you try to apply those principles at scale. And he looks at where you can use lean principles to enable that scale much more effectively. Fabrice has a wealth of experience working with clients and different companies, so his insights into the biggest challenges are really going to be representative across the industry. Well, I'm really excited for our conversation. So I'd like to welcome Fabrice to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to jump right in with the question that we always ask. What is the biggest problem that you're facing in product development? And that can be anywhere from coming up with the ideas right through to satisfy customers.
We've built hundreds of projects in very different contexts, different industries. So there's a lot of problems we face along the years. The one that I think is the hardest one, which will be probably a forever battle, is really when the product organization starts scaling and you start being dozens of teams, is how you maintain agility at that scale. That's the biggest problems we're facing. And of course, I can share what kind of things we're trying, but it's not easy.
To paraphrase there, it's the coordination effort involved when there's dozens of teams, or what's the problem that you're facing when there's dozens of teams?
First symptom, the pain, is often, why do I spend so much time doing internal work? Could be code maintenance, bug fixing, training, all these things that are maintenance tasks that the team say are necessary to keep the product live, but don't bring innovation, don't bring new value to customers.
And what's driving that? Why do you think that's happening in a lot of different organizations you've been in?
I'm assuming that you've solved the problem number one, which is how to be agile at the size of one team. And we've had this experience in Theodo, where in 2011, we really nailed how to be super agile on the size of one team. And that's incredible because you iterate super fast, you create a lot of value straight with the customer, iterating in production with users, and that's fascinating. What happens when you start scaling to 2, 3, 4, 10, 20 teams is really a problem of dependencies. All of a sudden, everything you do which requires a change in another team, and that soon becomes 90% of your work, requires coordination effort, and then there's a lot of ways to make it bad in a way. It can be that you start intervening in code that is not yours, so there's not like a product vision to the code you're contributing. It could be that some places in the product become, I don't know how to call them, zones without any ownership. So everyone contributes their way, but there's no more consistency. So you start getting a lot of bugs in that area. And here I'm talking really about quality issues that come from the dependencies. But there's also the first symptom is usually much more organizational, is like loads of teams being very busy doing stuff, but nothing comes out because there's no delivery coordination. There's no global prioritization. Everybody's optimizing at a local scale and actually treading on everyone's toes at the global scale.
So the symptoms that, as you described, it's those kind of quality issues. It's the slowdown in development speed that I think that will resonate with a lot of people, that as they scale, things seem to get slower. So what are your options? Because this is just, it seems like one of those things where people say, oh, it's just a symptom of scale, that you're going to slow down. What options do teams have out there?
First, I think the message of hope, or to share a bit what good looks like. We're doing software, and there's people who've had that problems of industrial scale in manufacturing decades before us. And I would believe that the problem is much harder for them, and they still manage to deal with it. So, of course, the leading innovator in that space, in the manufacturing space, has been Toyota. And what they've been doing has become known as the Toyota Production System, and what's become the lean thinking body of knowledge. And there's really a whole system about how you can look at your production system to create more value for customers and deal with the issues of speed and quality at scale. But long story short, there's two in the Toyota production system, which is often described as a house. There's two pillars. It's more like a temple. There's two pillars, and that really deal with the production side of things, which can be called Jidoka and just in time. To make it a bit more English sounding, I'd call them first time and just in time. That's what we've been doing for the last 12 years at Theodo, is really study how we can adapt these principles to our software environment. And now, to be very concrete, I'm thinking of one of the biggest projects that we've worked on recently. It was an incredible story. We started working on this product just before the COVID crisis. And so there's this moment where the government decides to start implementing lockdowns, and the client we're working with is partly owned by the French state, actually. And so they get the opportunity to build the whole digital platform that will distribute state guaranteed loans to all the small businesses that will have to close during lockdown. So we end up being at the heart of where things are happening, because we're there building the tech. They ask us, can you actually build a platform in the next 4 days? And it needs to be live in 5 days. And so I'm telling that because just to show you, that was our first big achievement, was launching the state guaranteed loans distribution platform in France in 4.5 days. And I'm not sure I've got the numbers right, but I think we had distributed like 400 million maybe.
Either way, it's very short timelines and a large amount of money.
Yeah, it was really like critical, and it was a very visible platform. It was not the most complicated product, but there were some key issues in terms of like scalability and security. So that's how agile you can be. And I'm just saying that first part of the story to say that, can you imagine once you start, then we start working on more long-term things and basically helping digitalize a lot of services. And then when you look at what this organization slowly becomes, and then you start seeing that it takes you about 4 or 5 days to deploy into production, you're thinking, how could I build a whole product in 4 or 5 days? The key moment here, and I think it's a good example, is just in time. Toyota teaches us something very interesting, which is how can you visualize bottlenecks? And there's a tool called the Kanban for that. One important point I would add to this is the way the word Kanban has been used in our software space. I would say it's misleading, because the Kanban tool, when you go back to where it comes from, which is Toyota, it's a tool that helps you see lead times, and it helps you see inventory that nobody's working on. So if basically you have a Trello board and you call it a Kanban, but you don't see the lead times and you don't have any columns saying this is what nobody's working on, then you're basically missing two of the key features that the Kanban is supposed to help you visualize. We put in place a Kanban at, we'd call it epic level, whole features level, with lead times, with the columns that said waiting for someone to do something. And yeah, and we identified really quickly one of the bottlenecks. And then we could, of course, start analyzing the problem solving, iterating, and we had this KPI of lead time. And we fairly quickly went from 5 days to deploy back to deploying multiple times a day.
Awesome. That's a really good win and demonstrating the value of it. You mentioned two things, right first time and just in time. So you gave an example there of just in time with the Kanban and real Kanban showing lead time. Can you explain what you mean by right first time?
It's very interesting, because I think the first thing you do is really think on the delivery side, the organizational side, and that's where just in time gives you so many tools. And just to give you a few keywords, in Lean, you would talk about single piece flow, one piece flow, a pull system, and a tag time. And all of this you could work on using a Kanban. So you really accelerate, start having deployment frequency that is back up. I'm using a lot of lean terms, but you would, if you're into the DevOps community, you would see it's a lot of DevOps concepts that they're very similar, if not the same. And then the second part is you realize, yes, we got some agility back, but there's still a lot of our backlog, which is bug fixing. Because you start reaching a scale at which, there's so many edge cases, so many users, and also like, I think that's an important thing that we shouldn't forget. Every time you add a small increment on top of a very large system that has a lot of complexities, and I'm just going to make it very simplistic, but imagine there's 1,000 potential user flows in your app, and you're adding like one little increment that changes many of these user flows. You've potentially added 2,000 new user flows to test, just because you're adding a B kind of pathway to the existing user flows. So every increment really adds like a ton of complexity. And that's why you can't just deal with it by hoping that Q&A will catch all the new workflows, all the new edge cases that you've introduced by your little increment. And so then you start asking, does it mean that I need to accept that it's going to be 20% of my time spent just on bug fixing all the edge cases that nobody will ever be able to detect before it's finally in production? And the answer is, again, if you look at Toyota, very impressive. They were in this industry where a lot of cars would have defects when they came out of production. What we would consider like shockingly high death rates on the roads at the time. And Toyota arrived with this built-in quality approach and had such orders of magnitude less defects that it completely redefined the automotive industry. And then everybody had to agree, okay, if they are able to do it, then we need to learn how to do it. And that's really built-in quality approach. And the built-in quality approach, I call it right first time, because I think if you aim for the ideal first time, which Toyota adopted as a culture, then you start putting in place mechanisms, and also you start adopting a culture that will really look at quality at a very early stage. And that's typically one thing that we've been implementing on the project I'm talking about now for a while. So it's way fresher as an example.
It's a good example. I change one thing and it will have ripple effects through use cases that maybe I'm not even aware of. So how practically do you build right first time? What are the actions that people on the teams are taking?
Our approach on right first time is heavily inspired by a book called The Toyota Way of Dantotsu, Radical Quality Improvement. And it's this incredible book, which is written by the senior leader at Toyota who was given the task of strongly improving the quality at 4 factories. A few of them had been acquired, so they were not initially like Toyota factories. And he tells a very operational story of how he went about it and the outcomes. And initially the huge resistance he had, which was reassuring for me, because I thought if the book says how easy it is, then I will not believe it. And it was incredible. And what I love about these kind of books is you can really adapt the principles, but you don't really understand what the principles mean unless you actually see the very practical way they've been implemented. And this book is really like a practical implementation of how to improve quality tenfold in a forklift factory. And it might sound completely alien to our software and product world, but the reality is they've got people working on stuff just like us. And so you really see how the role of the team leader is redefined, how the measurement of defects is redefined, and a lot of these things, which actually you realize it's the same for my product organization. I've got teams, I've got team leaders. I could redefine their role, etc., etc. And what we've done, which is our adaptation of it, first, start measuring the defects. It was one big idea, which I thought was really new to me and very interesting, is you really measure by stages of detection. The best way to get less defects is to measure them less. So what happens when you measure by stages of detection is, as a manager, when you manage this KPI, you can say, I don't want you to detect less. I want you to detect earlier. So all of a sudden, you can't really gain the KPI as easily. And so it also shows you who's measuring. They get a lot of early defects, and who's not measuring at all, they get no defects. You're like, okay, I don't trust that one. And then the game becomes about detecting defects earlier and earlier. what is now known as shift left. And I think that's really an incredible approach. And again, we've been doing that a lot in software and DevOps movement, probably also like some of the pioneers on that. But what I loved about the Dantetsu book, it was the first time that I saw the theory explained. I'd say in a bit of a deeper way. So he created the stages A, B, C, D. When we translate that software, we created A, B, C, D, E, because we thought we've got a big difference with the car manufacturer or forklift manufacturer. You can actually detect defects in production that the user has not. So this is this weird edge case where you can actually repair, which Tesla has initiated, which is repairing a car while it's on the road. That used to be completely alien. We do that all the time in software. We push in production, we realize there's a bug, we deploy the bug, no one complained, fine. So E is the user complained. That's the worst. D is the bug was detected in production. You were lucky you didn't get a complaint. Doesn't mean that it didn't impact anyone, but at least you didn't get a complaint. It wasn't detected by the user officially. And then C is detected by Q&A. B is detected by the team that produces defects. And then we can have a lot of interesting debates about that. And so there we'll put continuous integration, for example, tests failing, etc. And then A, we had a lot of debate about what does A mean. A would mean like the person coding actually detecting the defect. And we've actually experimented with that with amazing results. I'm not saying we've managed to scale it yet, but some teams have experimented with it, and it's really amazing. And basically you code, and if it doesn't work when you first try it in the browser or first try it in the phone simulator, then it's an A defect. So it puts the game into how can I make it work the first time I open the browser at my personal dev level. So I guess you understand why we call it right first time as an ideal. I found it was the most compelling way to do TDD. Because you say, okay, it's right first time if it works in the browser first. So of course I'm going to do a lot of tests. And then the second aspect I would say is, it's just an example, but I think it's an interesting anecdote. The way I do CSS is often trial and error in the browser. The teams who tried this approach actually went into a bit more CSS theory because they wanted to get it right the first time. And I think it's a super strong argument in favor of this approach because the time you're wasting trying to center things by trial and error when you could actually just go back a bit to the documentation and get it right. I don't want to spend too much time on my CSS skills not being good enough. And yeah, so that's one thing. Measure defects, measure them by stages, manage the fact that you want to shift left the number of defects towards continuous integration instead of in production. And then having a systematic approach to analyzing defects. It's called Dantotsu, which in Japanese means over the top, radical, extreme, because they were very extreme. The team leader wouldn't be in charge of analyzing every defect and had 24 hours to do that. Have we managed to do that at Theodo? Probably not. But yes, we're really strong on a culture of analyzing a lot of defects very regularly and having this systematic approach. I think really improved on what we call the standard, the way we document this analysis, which I think is very interesting, makes it very synthetic, very thorough. I think one of the key ideas I was actually discussing this morning is analyzing defects should not be archaeology spanning over multiple days. I think that's one of the risks is once you start analyzing, you want to understand really what happened. You become Sherlock Holmes, calling people who left the company. You start looking at commits that were done a year and a half ago, etc., etc. It's very interesting, but if you do that, you're not going to analyze all defects. And so you use the systematic approach. Whereas if you do the systematic approach, you manage to time box it in half an hour, then you start having much better intuition of what your quality issues are. If you share the learnings with the team, you start improving the knowledge of the team on really what matters. And then, of course, you start understanding where your weak points are. What are the recurring causes? Another idea is don't go mad on overreaction. That's one of the temptations. Oh, I've seen the root cause. I'm going to kill it forever. Oh, I've seen another root cause. I'm going to kill it forever. And the idea is to not forget you're working in a complex system. A lot of reactions in the complex system is probably going to move the system in ways you don't expect. So you analyze systematically defects. In a way, you get a better understanding of the issues you've done in the past. And once you start having a good intuition of where the problems are, then you decide, okay, I'm going to work on that one because I have at least 5 defects I can link back to that issue. And that's called in the weak point management.
Brilliant. So to summarize, the biggest problem you're seeing is very much at the delivery end of the product development cycle. And you're seeing the slowdown when you get to the point of this is what I want to build to having it out there in customers' hands. And there's the two sides of it. It's the slowness in releasing, but also making sure that what you're releasing doesn't come back and then you have to do multiple cycles. So if you get it right before you release, you reduce the lead time in 2 different ways.
It's a very good summary of my long
I just want to jump into, because it was a great example with the 5 days, but I know 99% of the work I've done has been brownfield projects. So it hasn't been greenfield where I can just start from scratch, because I know in my head I'd be perfect if I was starting from scratch. I'm sure I'd make lots of mistakes. But the problem I tend to come across is more brownfield. What I mean by that is, let's say I know it takes us 3 weeks to release, and I know what's happening. There's a very slow manual Q&A. There's people have to come in overnight and do releases because it's a very complex system. They haven't got any automation in. So how do you, coming from outside, try to implement these fixes in one of your clients when you're coming to visit them?
My first thing is really, do we know what value for the customer we're trying to deliver? Does leadership know what value means to their customers? And of course, they will know, but do they know it well enough? Have they modeled it in a way that is understandable? Do they know the challenges that they're facing in delivering that value? Before we try to heal the organization's delivery issues, like, let's first heal the North Star of the organization. Is the North Star, is it unique enough? Is it well-defined enough? Is it well communicated? So that would be my number one thing. And that in itself is a very interesting and challenging conversation. Now, let's assume that this part is decent. Then I would really look into, I would say, before we start trying to problem solve things, I really look into the culture of problem solving. And I'm talking in a large organization, because if I start saying, okay, we need to reduce lead time, but there's a culture of fear, or there's a culture of very low empowerment, it's going to be difficult. My second step of my frame would probably be, are teams good at problem solving? Can we, like, for example, put in place problem solving trainings, starting with management and then maybe everyone in the organization? Because the idea is, once you start seeing problems, once you start making problems visible, will the organization be able to react as a whole, rather than, just leadership having to all of a sudden deal with 1,000 of problems? And then the other idea, which is the organization designed in a way that the teams are fairly autonomous? How can we reduce the dependencies between the teams? What kind of technology can we use to reduce those dependencies? For that, by the way, I love the example of Amazon.com in working backwards. How they went from this terrible monolith where they were, it's very well described, but they were having all the issues you can imagine of big organization becoming very bureaucratic and having all these meetings to try to prioritize who gets to do what they want to do, to actually saying, okay, we need to completely reorganize and, put teams on clear domain bounded contexts, and then create the technology so that they actually have real autonomy, which was for them like a service architecture. It was very, very high quality. So that would be number 2. And then, number 3, I would say that's when you start putting in place things like Kanban, with visible lead time, with visible work in progress waiting to happen, which starts revealing problems everywhere. And hopefully by then you have an organization that feels positively challenged by seeing all these problems. And hopefully by then you have an organization that is not in total panic when they see all the problems and can start problem solving them and reacting and starting to do continuous improvement.
I want to dig into quite a few bits of that. I can't remember your exact wording, but it's don't accelerate crap, or you don't want to accelerate unless you're getting good value out there. So when you go into an organization, typically would you start there, or do you find that's not a problem for a lot of organizations? So you said that's where you would start if it was a problem. So are you seeing that commonly or infrequently?
It's rare that leadership doesn't know what they're doing. That can happen in very large organizations. That then you end up like in very bureaucratic environments. That's tough, where people are actually doing stuff for the sake of their own promotion rather than for the good of the customer. And dealing with that is probably, by the way, above my skills. I'm saying that, and I actually don't want to be too negative about it. In that example, I would come from the outside. And yeah, and you bring that kind of fresh challenge, and you refrain people, and they're like, oh yeah, thank you for bringing us back. And that's a lot what Lean Startup did in the early 2010s, telling people, wow, you should iterate with the users. And people are like, oh, this is game changing. And often I saw it as game changing in organizations that had forgotten that they had customers because they were so bureaucratic. And then you can have leadership that actually understands the value, but has not made it clear enough and compelling enough that actually teams know. And that's typically one of my huge criticisms of SAFe, is that the implementations I've seen of SAFe, devs on the ground end up executing a backlog and really having no visibility on what kind of value we're trying to deliver and why that backlog was given to them, and also really no opportunity to challenge that backlog with their local understanding of value. So, and I think actually the actual quote from Elon Musk is, if you're digging your grave, you don't want to dig faster, which is quite a nice one.
Just because you have a wealth of experience, I think it'd be very interesting for people. Can you give a very high level percentages of the three buckets? So the three that I heard from you there were very bureaucratic. The leadership don't even know the value. The middle one would be leadership know, but they haven't communicated that down to the devs. And the third bucket would be everybody knows. That's off the top of your head. I'm not going to hold you to these numbers.
Then I hope I don't get quoted by ChatGPT on that in the future. I'd say 20, 60, 20. It's probably a bell curve with the two extremes being the tails.
Yeah. I want to dig into the culture of problem solving. What is your definition? So in my head, while you were describing it, I was thinking of two different types of problems. There's the end user problem, which is what is the product we're trying to build and how are we going to solve the problem for the end user? And then there's the kind of the process problems of how are we working internally and how are we going to improve the problems that we're facing internally. I just wanted to dig into your point about the culture of problem solving to really understand, are you looking at one, both? What's your view on that?
The short answer is both. And yes, that's really a cornerstone of a lean culture. And you can trace it all the way back to two American professors, so Deming and Juran, were basically sent to Japan after World War II to help on the reconstruction. And they were told, can you teach all these like executives how to do good quality? And it's hard to believe, but at the time, Japanese was known for its really bad quality. The main explanation being they had put their best engineers and their best efforts on war stuff and not on the things they were exporting to the rest of the world. And so these professors that had really like this very innovative approach to quality, a very scientific approach to quality, they were trying to like spread their ideas in the US, but the people coming to their conferences were quality managers. They go to Japan, and all of a sudden, instead of having quality managers, they have all the chief executives of some of the biggest companies, and they have all these entrepreneurs. There's this guy, for example, who will later launch a company called Sony in the room. So these are the kind of people they're talking to, and they explain how they should have a much more scientific approach, and really think of there's a problem, what's the hypothesis, how can I experiment, whether my hypothesis is like right or wrong, And how can I check later? So Deming is known for introducing at the time the PDCA cycle. So I plan, which includes identifying, measuring the problem. Then I do my experiment, I check, and according to what I've learned, I act. PDCA, plan, do, check, act. And that's very strong now in the Toyota culture, which is where most of lean thinking comes from. And you can apply it everywhere. And I think in the current product management culture, you see it well applied and indeed in product stuff. So I've seen a lot of very good product managers and chief product officers formulating their gap to what they want to achieve in terms of product and their users. Formulate, I love this term, like one chief product officer calls it a BOTEC for back of the envelope calculation. So make this kind of check of what I want to achieve with the new feature I'm building, and then putting it in production, and then putting the analytics in place to actually check whether it works or not. You see it in all these continuous experimentation cultures like Booking.com and Amazon, etc. So we've got that. But I think what is amazing when you've got lean culture is you basically, everything which is not as expected is a problem that you can then quantify as a gap to an expected number. And then you could start analyzing what could be the causes. How do I check whether I'm right or wrong on the causes, and do something and check what the outcome was. And one big idea behind that, there's a few big ideas, but one is not, as an organization, stop jumping on the first intuition, but actually take a step back. And often when you take a step back, you realize your intuition is one possibility. There's 2 or 3 more that could actually also be very relevant. And all of a sudden, it opens your mind. You're like, oh yeah, let's check the 3. So that's one thing. And I guess it gives you a skill, especially if you're quite junior, to not be afraid when you see a problem. You're not like running in panic mode. What can I do? What can I do? You're like, okay, I know what I do. I formulate the problem. I list a few potential causes, etc., etc. But yeah, I think that's the 2 amazing benefits of this problem-solving culture.
Brilliant. The team topologies, love that concept. I really subscribe to the dependencies being the problem, and we need to make teams autonomous. But from my experience, very few companies have autonomous teams because they're either being constrained at a feature level. So teams might be split by, let's say, tech stack. So to build any feature, you need your mobile apps team, your web team, your services team. Or another way would be they split by customer journey. Okay, so you can build something by feature, but the underlying code base is still shared. So you have this merge conflicts. You have, as you were saying, gaps and lack of ownership of code. So what has been your experience? And then how do you help organizations to become more autonomous?
First, it's an ideal. Like, I don't have an example of perfect autonomy, of course. But what I've seen is, yes, you can reduce the amount of dependencies. Your example is really good. Like when you split by stacks, you add this crazy dependency that nothing valuable for the client will be doable without having to put so many teams together. So I'm a big advocate of full stack teams whenever possible. And by the way, this is maybe like for little tech addition to that, but typically React Native has made that much easier than before. So you can really have a team, and I'm not saying it's easy, but you can really have a team that has the ability to intervene on both web, Android, iPhone, mobile web, TV, all these platforms are now addressable by a tech stack like React Native. So there are solutions to that, and typically you should look into them. But then, and then there's a lot of about good bounded contexts. And I've not experienced it myself, but I've heard somebody say, I've done an event storming workshop with Alberto Brandolini. This is me like selling Alberto and saying the difference between doing an event storming workshop and doing it with Alberto is he's really going to challenge the organization to change these kind of boundaries to increase autonomy. So I think that's a very interesting point. Is you need to map the existing domains, you need to visualize them, and then you also need to do some probably courageous challenging of things to make them simpler. And then, there's a lot of effort to be put into the APIs. I don't have a secret recipe for that, but what I love in what was known as the API mandate, and we don't really know if Jeff Bezos said it that way, but that's the way it's reported, where he said your APIs need to have the quality of something we would actually deploy to customers, which is a great way of emphasizing the value of an API. And I guess of that, probably communities of practice around APIs, training. Yeah, no silver bullet on that one. Sorry.
I'm going to come back now, piecing all the different bits together. So you could have a problem with a lack of understanding of value. And if we don't have that, there's no point empowering your teams because they don't really understand the context of why they're doing it. You have the culture where they can solve those problems and have the skills and an approach to solving them, which again is another, I think, key criteria of empowering the teams. Then you need to empower the teams. And then finally, it's, as you were saying, don't dig your own grave before
Don't dig it fast.
Don't dig it faster. So then you can get into what you said at the start was the biggest problem. So is it a case that you can skip some of those steps? Because in a lot of organizations I've worked with, those first 3 steps aren't in place. So do you think or can start it at the end?
No, I call it my biggest problem because I think we've got a good culture approach of clarifying value, and we've got a lot of tools around that. One tool that we've not really published yet, but I think it's very interesting, is called the product architecture. So we create this visualization of all the trade-offs that the value trade-offs that we're working on. And then the team empowerment, I think it's a constant work in progress. You're always like redefining kind of the boundaries, working on them, etc. But usually you often start brownfield. Well, I have the experience of sometimes starting greenfield, and therefore the problem comes progressively. So it's more of a continuous effort on that. And and then Jidoka and just in time are problems that appear with scale, which I think are probably more intense because I think culturally, then at some point you say, look, it's not that bad. The others are doing as bad. So this is often when it becomes harder because you're like, no, we can do much better. So that's why I find them hard.
And I guess that leads into my next question. You're coming from outside, which, as you said, is a superpower in ways because you can say to people, open your eyes, look at different things. You can have a different perspective that people might not have. But equally, I think you don't understand us when you come in with some ideas because you don't have enough context of their situation. So when you start working with an organization, how do you build their trust to start making the changes that you're advocating for?
That's interesting. And maybe that ties into your previous question, which is, and this is very specific to us, but often if we have to build that kind of trust, then we'll do it progressively. So we'll probably start working on delivering stuff. And therefore, the first thing we have to prove is that we're very good at delivery. Very good at quality. And it's only when we have built that kind of trust and we start having a good brand and a good recognition on that, then we can start talking about bigger picture issues, which are often product issues, value issues, and then organization issues.
I guess one of the challenges I've had in trying to empower teams in particular is there's a lot of anxiety in the organization. If you start empowering the teams, it's going to be headless chickens running everywhere. Have you encountered people having that kind of anxiety that we won't get the important work done? And how do you overcome that?
I would also be one of them. It's like the Marty Kagan kind of empowerment, which means you give teams a business KPI and then let them run with it. I think it probably requires either a lot of seniority in the teams or a lot of budget and time to experiment around things. So how do I address it? I think one of the prerequisites, and it's not said enough, would really be to work hard on what value is, on what the challenges are, and really communicate it really well. And typically one thing that Toyota does extremely well in these cases is they have these big rooms, they call them obeyas, where they will make it very visual, what the goal is, what the customers are saying, what kind of model we have of what they want, what we need to be good at, what are all the challenges that we don't really understand how we're going to address them, but they are like the things we've tried. And so a lot of information so that everybody is aware of that. And I think if you create that kind of environment, and then you say to the team, look, this is where you fit, it's much more reassuring for everyone. It's reassuring for leadership that thinks, okay, they know where they fit into my strategy, and I know they've got the right skills. And by the way, one really important point in the lead culture, which we call the undone, is also making sure that if there's an issue in the team, the escalation can be very quick. Because then again, it's very reassuring if you're like, okay, teams have a lot of autonomy, they're very empowered, but as soon as they hit an issue, they ask somebody above to help them. And if there's somebody above doesn't know how to help them, they ask somebody above and all the way to the top. And that means that there's a very quick communication around, sorry, I went in the direction and I didn't really know what was happening. Oh, good, time to synchronize and clarify the challenges. So I think giving a lot of context to the teams and making sure that when things go wrong, it gets identified by the team very quickly, and that they have the culture of asking for help very quickly if they can't solve it themselves.
Okay, I like measuring where your escalation happens. So is it being caught before the same way you measured with your defects? Yeah. How far does it get up before you've escalated it? Is it?
It's the same idea. Is you want to realize the team went in the wrong direction after spending $1 million or after spending 10,000? I think everybody will answer 10,000 is good enough.
I've really enjoyed our conversation, and I'll summarize it and you can let me know if you agree. So the biggest challenge you're saying is really on the delivery end, and it's the speed at which companies, as they're scaling, they tend to slow down because they just don't have the right practices and processes in place. But by adopting lean culture, you can start identifying where your bottlenecks, do just-in-time delivery, and also investing in quality to get it right first time. But then in order to get that to work properly, you need to layer that on top of autonomous teams who can problem solve and figure out what they need to do so they can iterate quicker. But in order to do that, they need to understand the value proposition of what we're trying to solve. So it's quite an organizational challenge, but the root cause of why things are slowing down as we scale.
Yeah, it's a whole system.
Thank you very much for joining. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. I hope everybody out there did as well.
Thank you very much.
If you'd like to know more about the ways you can remove the blocking dependencies from your processes, check out zeroblockers.com or follow us on your favorite social platforms.